6 years ago, we invited Joan Morgan to be our visiting artist for the year. And you can clap for that. You can definitely clap for that. Joan's an award-winning journalist and influential cultural critic. She was the former executive editor of Essence, and she had coined the phrase hip-hop feminist in 1999 in her groundbreaking book, When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost. But in 2012, she was wanting to take the work in new directions. And so Joan's hip-hop, and so of course what she did was she assembled a crew. And they would come to call themselves the Pleasure Ninjas. And what a crew it was. Dr. Brittney Cooper, an associate professor of women and gender studies and Africana studies at Rutgers University, and you can feel free to give her a hand. The co-founder of the popular Crump Feminist Collective blog, and the author of Eloquent Rage, A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower. Dr. Treva Lindsay, Associate Director and Director of Undergraduate Studies of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at The Ohio State University. Please give it up. And the author, of course, of Colored No More, Reinventing Black Womanhood in Washington, D.C. It's out now, cop it. And Dr. Kaila Diaz-Story, an associate professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies and Pan-African Studies at the University of Louisville, who holds, yes, please, who holds the Audre Lorde Chair in Race, Class, Gender, and Sexuality Studies there, and also hosts a weekly radio show called Strange Fruit, Musings on Politics, Pop Culture, and Black Gay Life, which is also available as podcast. That was the crew. That was the crew. And so today you'll get to hear how they've been rethinking feminism through hip-hop and rethinking hip-hop through feminism. Please welcome the Pleasure Ninjas.
Wow, this is like quite a crowd. This is really a great room. This room doesn't often look like this at Stanford, so it's good to be here. It's good to be back. For us, it's really special to be here. So just a bit of history about the ninjas. So I have a couple different lives. So there's the bio stuff that Jeff read to you, and I'm also a graduate student, a doctoral candidate at NYU in American Studies. And so I actually thought that I was going to grad school so people would stop asking me about hip hop and feminism. I figured if I actually got a, degree in something else, maybe people would think I could talk about other things. So I felt like I didn't want to do anything hip hop related in grad school, and I didn't want to do anything feminism related. But I had this whole other life outside of grad school as Joan Morgan, where everything I do is feminist related, right? So I decided in terms of my feminism work that I was really, what kept coming up for me in talking about hip hop were all of the problems with the way that Black women's sexuality is represented. So a lot of talk about misogyny or hypersexuality, and all of those things, like we could make links to that back to this racialized violence that of course has its root in the transatlantic slave trade. But I also felt that there was another language to describe our eroticism, our sexuality, our engagements with pleasure, and I found like there was no place, there were so few places in Black feminist theory where we got to view ourselves through the lens of pleasure. And so I started to wonder what happened if we held this thing and acknowledged it, because we can't act like this racialized violence didn't happen, that racism didn't happen, but the way that I move through the world as a Black woman is not solely defined by racism and violence and sexism. And so I wanted to talk about pleasure. I didn't find a whole lot in the existing archive on Black feminist theory that used that lens. And I already know as a Black feminist that I write shit that pisses people off, even Black feminists. So, because I'm hip hop, I was like, what's a crew that I could roll with to do this work. And so I also needed a place to kind of put this together. And because I'm hip hop, I was like, yo, Sammy, so what y'all got popping in Stanford? Because I kind of need okay, so here's what I need. I need time and I need enough resources to put 5 dope Black women together. Esther Arma is not here, that's another Pleasure Ninja. And we need time to just really think about what it would mean to deeply incorporate pleasure as a viable lens in our scholarly, our artistic, our cultural criticism. What would that look like? And so Sammy was like, I think I can do that. Will you teach a class? And I was like, I could teach a class, I think. I'll just have to go back to my chair and say, okay, in the middle of this graduate program, I'm leaving to go teach a course at Stanford. And so I asked Sammy what it would be on. He said, whatever you want. And so what I wanted to do was to do this class on pleasure politics. And pleasure politics really started here. I had an amazing class of 15 students. And I told them, I said, I'm not teaching you theory, we're gonna make theory. We're going to look at this syllabus, we're gonna look at these key critical works in Black feminist theory and say, where does pleasure come in? Where do we make a space for pleasure? What are the things that stop us from looking through the lens of pleasure? What are the cracks in cultural dissemblance? If you're talking about it in 2012, what doesn't controlling images allow us to see and express about ourselves? And so, you know, that class did some amazing work. So then I went back to NYU and then was like, so by the way, I'm completely changing my dissertation topic after 2 years of coursework. And so, you know, the ninjas started here at Stanford. We had those days. We had a lot of fun, but we really, really, really spent those 4 days together thinking deeply about what it meant to embrace pleasure as a lens. And there were a lot of things that we didn't always agree. Some of it was really difficult. Some of it troubled, it got really emotional, troubled areas that we didn't know we would trouble, but we've all found a way to make a commitment to bring pleasure into the work. And so, 5 years later, we've also managed to become incredible friends. We have traveled, really at this point, over the world. You know, we've been able to do this in Italy, we've been able to do this in Paris, we've been able to do this in venues that are not necessarily like academic. We've been able to do it in very traditional academic spaces. We've been able to do it on videos. We've been able to do this in multiple kinds of ways, and I'm deeply proud of that. I'm deeply grateful to Sammy, to Ida, for allowing me to run with this really crazy idea. You know, pleasure politics is now a thing. It's a thing that's often cited. It's a thing that people feel slowly committed to explore. And that's really exciting to me because I believe that the best feminist work is usually collective work, where Black women's scholarship and activism and cultural critique support each other. And so we just want to kind of catch you up and tell you what we've been doing with this for like the last 5 years.
So thank you to Sammy and Jeff and Stanford, and thank you to Joan. So I guess the thing that I want to say, and I always say this anytime I'm paneling with Joan, in part because one of the key sort of methods that should matter to us is always a genealogy. Who are the folks who come before us? Who are the people that we're citing? We should never forget that. And it's interesting, right, because I understand hip hop culture to be deeply citational, right? So when you look at hip hop music, the thing that's always interesting is the incredible levels of literacy that hip hop artists have in terms of who they're listening to, what they're watching. So you miss whole levels to hip hop music and dance if you if you're not up on pop culture, and if you don't know music history, if you don't know the history of performance art, right? And so it's really important to say that I don't think any of the work that I'm doing around sort of contemporary Black feminism would be possible without Joan. When she wrote Chicken Heads, so I was like this real conservative Southern Black girl who was trying to do what Jesus wanted me to do. She did not know me then, thank God. She didn't know me, and she did not know me. And so this book helped me when I was learning the language of feminism, when I was learning how it was relevant to my life, and at the same time, when I was learning it from Black feminist elders who were older and who weren't down for hip hop. And so then I had a book that I could take into a classroom and say, this is my generational soundtrack, and I'm not giving it up, even though I want to fight the patriarchy, right? Even though I want to say, like, we don't want a world of sexism and male dominance and all of that, I also really want to, knock this whatever, Jay, Pac, Big, whoever, like I want to own those people and all the women as well. And so I had the sort of arsenal to go into the room and fight the battles and do it in a loving way. And I think that that is also this way that hip hop informs my feminism, that it takes that sort of defiant thing where you want to fight people, and it gives you the tools to do it effectively. And Joan, you did that. I've told you before, but it's important to say it over and over again. Mm-hmm. It's important to say it in a social media moment where a lot of our ideas float and then people don't give credit. Mm-hmm. Every time I hear pleasure politics and people aren't citing Joan, I'll be like, what you doing? What are you doing? Right? Okay. That's not how this works, right? Mm-hmm. And so I want to say that too, that one of the things that I most admire, I appreciated in 2013 being invited into this conversation, because I was like, Joan about to do it again. She about to fuck shit up again. Mm-hmm. Here she goes, right? This is what she does. It's like, because she takes this outside lens, she looks at it and then she goes like, nah, that's actually not gonna work. And I think that the reason it matters and the reason, so how I understand hip hop and pleasure politics and Black feminism, the thing that makes them all work for me together is that they are livable politic. You can stretch out and grow and breathe. And I want to say that because I think the other thing that happens in this moment is everybody wants to be woke, right? Everyone is very pressed to get it right, to get your language right, to get your pronouns right, to make sure you name every intersection that you have, to name every system. And look, I'm not telling you to be raggedy and be out here doing violence to people. I'm not saying that at all. Mm-hmm. I am saying that hip hop was about being wrong in the best ways possible, right? And it allows us sort of space to stretch out and grow. And so Black feminism also gave me the place to do that because it gave me a place to sort of own the magic of what it meant to be a Black girl in a world that doesn't want Black girls and femmes to live. And so it's that, right? And then it's this and then pleasure politics meant that it was, that we had to commit to actually building the world we wanted to see. So I was happy to be invited because to me, all of those things make sense. I listen to hip hop on my way to teach feminist classes, in which I'm like, fuck the patriarchy, but in the car, hey, break it down. Okay, sorry.
I just want you to know that I've had the experience of being in the car with and me, and this hip-hop feminist going, okay, that's enough.
I mean, we serenaded Joan with Break It Up last night. It was a very good rendition. Anyway, that's no
feminist version.
What's a feminist? Okay, sorry. So it's like in the car, I'm getting ready, and then I go in and I'm like, this is all bad. Like, this is sexist, right? So I want to be clear. That's not about contradiction. That's about but you put your armor on, right, when you go into these spaces, and I feel like that's what hip hop does for me. And I feel like we have the ability, y'all, to hold all our contradictions. So that's why I do this work, because I am committed to trying to create knowledge that's going to actually help us to get free. And that means that it sometimes doesn't look as dogmatic as we think it should. It's not always correct. But hopefully, the way that you'll know that it'll help you get free is because on the one hand, you will feel clearer, but you won't feel like the thing you're trying to do is utterly impossible in every moment. There should be a way that it helps you to exhale. And if it never helps you to exhale, then it's not a freedom politic at any level.
What's up, everybody? So it is so wonderful to be back here with Jeff and Sammy and Ida and Stanford, because this was such a life-affirming project to begin with as it began here. And I don't think there were ways to know how much it would be over the last almost 5 years now that it would be, but to echo Brittney, Joan saved my life twice with the work that she did. When I was 18 reading Chicken Heads and figuring out my voice. I'd always been very politically involved and engaged. My parents called me their little Angela Davis. So I always had a sense of equity and justice when I was little. I wanted everybody to have the same thing and a sense of fairness. So that was always part of me. But that bravado, to feel like you could take on the world that you need to fight these systems of anti-blackness, to fight misogyny, to fight homophobia, to fight these things. There's a bravado that hip hop kind of gave you, and to find language from a Black woman to tell me it was okay not to just occupy that, but to also wrestle with the complexities of what it meant to exist in that world, what it meant to rail against sexism, but not want to throw anybody away in that process. And there was language that gave me as an 18-year-old that I was like, I think I'm a feminist. I think I'm a hip hop feminist, because I'm also at the time listening to 3 6 Mafia, right? Yes. So there was a way that I'm trying to reconcile, and I felt I was at war with myself, I was at war with my community, and I'm not actually taking it in as the war that's happening on our communities, right? I took it as an internalization of something that was wrong, so it helped me then. And then in 2013, when the Pleasure Ninjas were formed, and she's telling me about this project, and it sounds so dope, and who she's assembling, and I want to say, we all didn't know each other like that. Joan was the connector between all of us at that point. And it would bring me a sisterhood that has sustained me in the horrors that can be the academy. In moments where my project now is largely about violence against Black women. And so having a space, a workspace, a collaborative space, a sisterhood space where we just laugh and love on each other really, really hard, has been life-affirming and life-sustaining. So for me, that intersection that comes in of what hip-hop at its best does, what pleasure politics allows us to think about, is in a world that is anti-Black, anti-femme, anti-queer, that it gives us a space to say, fuck that shit, right? And in the way that only hip-hop can, right? To articulate that, and to say, I am going to not just survive this, but I'm going to live and thrive. And it gives a creativity to it, because I learned how to critique and engage within the context of hip hop, and doing that work around this, how I hear and think about patriarchy and all that. I learned that within hip hop, but part of hip hop is not just being able to do that kind of criticism that I think is important and meaningful, to be able to recognize these systems for what they are, right? But to also imagine and to build. Because the spirit in hip hop is also an imaginative and creative spirit, right? And it's produced on the margins of the margins, right? Where that work is being done. And so to harness that creative energy, but also realize that alongside of that, we have to laugh and love with each other. That is part of this revolutionary work. Do you know what it means to revolutionarily love one another in a space that tells you none of us are worthy of love? That none of us are worthy of care? Right? That the politics of white supremacy, meaning the politics of white inhumanity, is constantly telling you that you need to prove your humanness to somebody, right? So it's getting in a space that's recognizing the humanity of ourselves in a whole other way, that's never about us having to humanize ourselves for somebody else, or worried about what you think about our humanity, because I'm quite clear that 400 years of history tells me the inhumanity of whiteness is what needs to be on Front Street. Right? So if we're thinking about it in that context, hip hop gives me the bravado to say that publicly and unapologetically, right? And we get to say it a bunch of different ways, right? I'm not an MC, but I have wordplay. I mean, that's what we do.
But you got bars, though.
Bars. And
Okay,
so,
yes.
you know, there's a way that we learn a certain vocabulary of justice. We learn a vocabulary of critique. And I do it from the place of hip hop often because I actually love it. Right? There's a love that I have for it. I don't need to critique shit. Like, I'm not worried about certain things because they're not about me. They're not my community. And the communities that I'm invested in being with, convening with, and doing the work with are engaging with hip hop. I can't sit here and say I care about young people and where we're headed and then be like, but fuck hip hop, because it does X, Y, and Z. Let's get at what that X, Y, and Z is. Let's talk about that. Let's commune with each other, and let's do collaborative work with one another, right? Let's really live out a politics of indisposability with one another. And part of articulating that politics means we have to be able to have pleasure together. That we have to recognize that. We can't just recognize the trauma that is part of our lives, right? That is structuring, right? We can't let white supremacy win that shit too, right? We can't let misogyny win that too. We can't let patriarchy win that too. The ability to love, the ability to care, the ability to laugh, to shake, to have ecstasy, right? These are things that are so fundamentally important to us getting free that I think it was such an important intervention for Joan to think, like, this is a freedom project, right? It's a freedom project. It's a freedom project first and foremost for Black women and Black femmes, but it gets us all freer. I mean, we learned this from Kabahi, right, and 40 years ago, right? Our keys to freedom and how we get there, right, is if we can liberate the Black woman, then we all get free, right? Because you're looking at these intersections of racial oppression, gender oppression, sexual oppression, right? All these different forms of oppression. And at that intersection, when you see Black women, so when we get freer in our fullest selves, then justice just gets a little bit closer each time we give Black women space to show up and show out.
Yes. Okay, yes. Yes, I mean, I love everything that everyone has said, and that's exactly how I felt when I read Joan's book. I felt like, as a student, I read Joan's book when I was 19, and I was like, who is this? Because I felt like, one, it had all those elements of hip-hop, right? Audacity, bravery, it was improvisational, it was working through a bunch of different things that were going on in academia, but also outside of it. I mean, I noticed for me, who was a women and gender studies undergrad, and then I went to Black studies at Temple, there was a certain type of gatekeeping going on with these supposedly liberatory disciplines, right? So these are activist-oriented disciplines that I was a part of, but there was gatekeeping going on. I mean, there was a lot of homophobia, and misogyny up in Black studies. There was a lot of whiteness and white supremacy up in women's studies. And for me, I felt like Joan's book really disrupted that gatekeeping for me. It gave me and provided me with the type of theoretical underpinning I needed to navigate both of those disciplines in a way that was unapologetic and unabashed, right? Like, this is the type of Black feminist I am, and I'm gonna bring the Black feminist self in every space. I'm gonna talk about race and women and gender studies. I'm gonna talk about gender and sexuality in Black studies. And I feel like we're still mired down in parts of academia with this type of gatekeeping, right? There's a certain type of ownership, it seems like, white women and femmes feel to feminism, and it ain't theirs. And I mean, the genealogy ain't even there for them on that. So the genealogy ain't on their side, the history ain't on their side, but there's still this type of universalizing and the suppression of women of color in those spaces. So I feel like that's what Joan's book provided me with. I really felt like it melded all the parts of me, feeling like, even when it came down to ideas of professionalism, professional dress, and this idea of how a professor carries oneself. I mean, I've always felt very disruptive in my aesthetic and my disposition, and, you know, I'm gonna be me, right? And a part of that was incorporating the type of energy that hip hop provides, which is basically against a lot of working systems, countering all these other working systems, and embodying that in a way that made me friendly and familiar to students, but also made me get their respect, because I feel like as an effective educator, you have to
be able to, make your students understand where they're at. You gotta meet them where they're at. And my students, and they continue to be. I mean, now I'm getting older, and so sometimes they be coming in like, oh, Doc, you done heard? And I'm like, no, I'm listening to stuff from the 90s. I haven't heard, right? So I don't be up and up, but it creates the space where now I can learn from them. It creates this even exchange, and I think that Joan talked about that too in her book, right? This idea that we're facilitators of knowledge in a space. Like the MC doesn't own the entire space, right? There are all these different elements to hip hop, and everybody has a kind of ownership over it. And I feel like that's important. I feel like merging hip hop with pleasure, and even thinking about, especially when it came to ideas around queer sexuality that is seen as deviant, forbidden, still mired, homophobia, transphobia, all that kind of stuff goes into it. But at the same time, because homophobia exists, it seemed like to me, anytime queer sexuality was discussed, it was about this idea of tolerance or acceptance or politics of sameness, right? Like, I'm just like you, you're straight and I'm a lesbian. And it's like, no, we're nothing alike, and that's cool, and you need to respect me, you know what I mean? Like, we don't, you know what I'm saying? Like, we're nothing alike, and that's cool, right? So like, and then also talking about the pleasure in that, right? I mean, when it comes to comprehensive sex ed, like K through 12, students more and more aren't getting comprehensive sex ed, and when they do get it, they're not talking about queer sexuality and the pleasures that come from that. And when they are getting straight sexuality, they're not talking about the pleasure when it comes to that. And I think that, one of the biggest pathways for me in my own empowerment has been that pleasure, has been erotic pleasure, has been the idea that sex is not about service nor sacrifice, that it's about consent and feeling good. And I think that that's a pathway to empowerment. And I felt like nobody really was talking about that. And I didn't even know I wanted to talk about that until I meet Joan. I mean, one, I was like obsessed with Joan. I was teaching her book already. And then when I met her at that, what was that, the Caribbean, some kind of conference, child, in Harlem, when I met her and I started crying immediately, I didn't know what to say to her. And I mean, even now, like sitting on a panel and she like talks to me and like we're friends, and it's still very daunting. I mean, she's a huge hero of mine who really set me free in all these ways that she has no idea that she did. I mean, honestly, and, so I felt like, yeah, I mean, and she said, we're talking on this panel, and she's like, yo, what's up with the pleasure though? Like, Black feminism got so bogged down with oppression and classism and racism, and, and there was no talk about it. And I didn't even realize at the time that I wanted to talk about that, right? Because I had certainly in my own life incorporated pleasure politics and those types of things, but didn't necessarily know that we should be talking about this at a theoretical level, at a livable level, and a practical level. So, yeah, I mean.
I just wanted, if we could each just say briefly about talk about some of the specific ways we've incorporated pleasure politics into our work. And then I wanted to engage with the audience, because that's kind of where we come alive. So, Treva, you want to start?
Let's see. It's so fascinating because it's like literally I got into Pleasure Ninjas and then my next book became about violence. So I feel like really terrible.
Damn, T.
It's like shit. But what has happened with that, in fact, is that in the way that like this is scholarship for me, and I've theorized and obviously talked about pleasure and the work that I do in thinking about insurgency and activism, how pleasure plays out on the front lines and movement spaces, where we see that, where you see, recently wrote a piece on like Black feminist insurgency, how we reclaim insurgency as a tool that we think about, and looking at that through the lens of the era of movement for Black lives, and seeing the kinds of things. You see people voguing at protests, you see people doing double dutch, you see people twerking, you see all of these different elements. You have songs that come on and, that become part of the movement culture. And so you see the ways that that shows up and how that becomes part of insurgent energy. And so pleasure being a space, even when we're facing down the absolute terror of police right? The absolute terror of state violence, the absolute threat of incarceration, et cetera. That even in those moments, we know pleasure is one of our weapons. We know pleasure is one of our rights to inhabit, one they can't immediately take away. There are these moments, these ephemeral things. So that was one way it kind of showed up in my work, but quite honestly, it became my saving, like my sacred space to come back to, because I couldn't wake up and write about the murders of Black women, and I didn't want to go to bed writing about that either. And so working with, having these conversations with my fellow pleasure ninjas and thinking about other projects, the next project's on the 90s, it's called 90s Kind of Girl, and looking at representations of Black womanhood in the 90s where there's a lot of pleasure space. I'm like rewatching A Different World and Living Single and rewatching Set It Off, which ain't really pleasure, but I love it. But it's a wonderful, you know, kind of moment, and like re-listening to Mary J. Blige and girl groups. So there's all these ways that those become the things that I wake up doing and go to bed doing. So Pleasure Ninja became a practice that is a self-care practice as I'm writing about how we're being killed. And so in that way, the Pleasure Ninjas, when I say it's life affirming, it actually emboldens my other work. It gives me another way to think about the resistance that we're mounting in response to anti-Blackness, and it gave me a way to actually make it through this next project, because I became extremely unhealthy in the beginning of writing this project because it was so much. When I'm sitting and looking at statistics like, damn, right, a Black woman's killed every 19 hours, boom, right? 3 women are killed by partners every day in the US, boom, right? Like I'm looking at all of this. I'm reading autopsies, I'm reading reports about Black women's death. Everybody now, because they know I'm doing that project, like sends me links to various things of happening to children, right? People will send me, this thing happened to this Black girl in this classroom. This is good for your project. Like, yes, this is good for my project, right? Like that's a moment, right? Like that violence against Black women is what I have to archive. And so the Pleasure Ninjas gave me a different archival space to dig into as a way to both remind myself what pleasure means in terms of resistance, but also saving me from becoming enveloped in the death-dealing ways of white supremacy and misogyny.
Can you say a bit about the Harriet Tubman piece?
Sure. So I did, again, in the model of collaborative work with my really good friend and amazing historian and digital humanist Jessica M. Johnson, wrote a piece about Harriet Tubman. And it wasn't all beloved by a lot of Black feminists, but has been taken up because it's the erotic life of slavery. And we looked at Harriet Tubman and her life to really start imagining what it means to think about pleasure in spaces of terror, to think about the ways that the liberatory expectations of our 20th and 21st century notions of what we need slavery to do in this moment. We need to know slavery was a totalizing and terrible and terrorizing institution in order to make certain kind of claims to freedom right now, right? But what that does is, even though it's not the same dehumanizing way that some slavery work does, it does dehumanize us to not affirm that our ancestors found moments to connect to one another, to touch one another, that the ability to be felt and to feel, even if ephemeral and even if fleeting, were life-affirming ways. So we had to be imaginative in the space of the archive, because, right, like orgasms don't show up in the archive that often. We had to think about that. And so we used a figure that's Black Moses, right? This incredibly, now revered woman who was at the time a wanted woman, right? She's an enemy of the state who now may be on a $20 bill, right? She's an enemy of the state, but she's wanted in other ways, right? She ends up partnering with someone almost 20 years her junior. If that ain't about pleasure, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. Make of that what you will. But after having and then resistance ecstasy, like what it meant to go back and keep going back for people, right? That energy you feel in your body knowing certain things. So we were trying to map that in relationship to freedom and what it meant as a historiographical project to actually say, let's think about, don't discount any of the subjection that's part of slavery that we know, but also can we give something to our ancestors in terms of reimagining and reinvigorating their lives through the ways in which we tell their stories. that they found ways to love in space that was completely unloving. They found ways to touch in ways in which their bodies are completely massacred and desecrated by those around them. So finding moments of sacredness that come with that, of ecstasy, of fun, that are, again, fleeting, because it's slavery, right? But they're so important to recover. So working with the Pleasure Ninjas, I think we got a lens for that. I think I became, again, that bravado, emboldened to think, all right, I know they're not gonna like this, but they don't like me anyway. Okay. So, they don't like, it is what it is. So we're gonna actually ask the questions and force the conversation. And now you do actually have more work that's asking questions about slavery in this context, that's looking at Black women's lives during slavery, that we can say the erotic in slavery, right? And we not solely be talking about, and it never should be talking about, sexual violence is different than an erotic practice, right? Those are different things. So actually giving us language to think about both of those.
Thanks, Treva. Brittney?
So I try to do pleasure work in a couple of different arenas in my life. So I just published a book called Beyond Respectability, and it was about all of these sort of historical boss chicks, Black women who ran shit 100 years ago. But because they ran shit 100 years ago, everyone thinks of them as like respectable only and buttoned up and, very elitist and middle class. And there was a way that when I read their work, I was like, so I talk in my book about this woman named Mary Church Terrell, who was like, her and her crew were bad and bougie to the nth degree in 1895. You know what I mean? But Mary Church Terrell tells all of these stories about how she would sneak out of the dorms at Oberlin and go out dancing, and how people didn't think that you could go out and dance and be a person who was high class. And then in her book that she's writing like 40 years later, she's like, I still love to dance. And she was like, she called it To Trip the Light Fantastic. She was like, I still love to trip the light. I was like, get it, chick, like do it. I'm like, hey, come on now, I'm not tripping no light, no type of way, but all right now. And so then I just sort of played around with and she was like, and I was a very good dancer. And I was like, so what would it mean to think of Mary Church Terrell, who we know is this kind of buttoned up race woman figure, as somebody who's twerking in the gym in the middle of the night, right? Because she was trying to say, look, I had skills. I was about that life, and I was really committed to it. And so I try in the work of humanizing those women and the stories we tell to see how were they were out here talking about lynching, stop lynching our people, stop killing our people, but they also had moments where they had fun and where they danced and where they fucked, right? And like, I love reading, yes, right? And it feels important to say that because everyone is always like, oh, because these Black women, mammies, right, who are asexual, and then people have all these feelings about it, and it's like, well, the way for us to stop seeing them that way is to stop telling that story about them, right? Because it's not the story that they told about themselves, right? So it's like one of the stories I love about Ida B. Wells, she has a published diary, and I don't write about this in my book, but Ida B. Wells, anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Wells, she had a shopping habit. And so there's a story in her diary about how she went down to the dress store and they had lots of pretty dresses, and so she bought too many of them and then she couldn't pay her rent. And look, the other thing about Ida B. Wells is Ida B. Wells was a player, for real. Like, Ida B. Wells kept a string of dudes rolling through the parlor. Like, don't get it twisted. You read that diary and she's like, and I'm not gonna tell him I love him till he tell me he love me. Okay, girl, I'm not mad. And so so I'm like, we gotta tell a different story about these women. They had full lives, right? And because when you get to be 60 and there's a bunch of young people being like, you don't know nothing, you don't know shit, and you'll be like how our elders talk to us, because our elders are like, I'm thinking about Beverly got Chef on that panel, Lord. And she just be like, we had fun. We had lots of fun. And I'll be like, I don't wanna know about the fun you had. I don't wanna know. Right? But I can do it with women born 100 years ago. And so that's the way that I sort of try to get the pleasure in my work. The other place I do it, I'm a church girl. I'm like a preacher's kid. But I can't stand the sort of narrative of sexuality that comes out of Black evangelical churches. I think it's death dealing. I think it's death dealing to queer folks, but I also think it's death dealing to Black women. And so on our Crunk Feminist blog several years ago, I anonymously, because I wasn't quite as brave at that time, wrote this piece called Single, Saved, and Sexin', which was about how I was like a church girl and I had a sex life. And Lord, y'all, anybody who grew up in the church, y'all know how church people acted. They showed out really bad, really, really bad. But now in my work, but it's like, fuck all that. Like, let's get free, right? And if you really believe in Jesus, then Jesus wants you to get some too, girl. So like... Get some. Okay, so part of the work of doing pleasure politics, and this is what I love, it's the thing Joan said about how in her class here, she said, we're gonna build theory, we're gonna do theory, we're gonna make theory. And so I'm literally, part of the work that I do is about how can we create a theology of pleasure? Like, how can we equip people who are in this sort of real conservative faith tradition to see that pleasure can be a priority, that pleasure is a spiritual matter, that pleasure is erotic and divine, and that you can have pleasure on purpose, and that can be a part of how you move theologically, as opposed to being in opposition to it. So I just wrote a piece that'll come out next year called How Sarah Got Her Groove Back. That's all about the biblical figure of Sarah, who asked this question in the book of Genesis, where she says, shall I have pleasure? It's there. And so if you wonder whether biblical figures had a pleasure politic, yes, they did, right? And so I try to use pleasure as a lens to try to figure out, when are Black women articulating an erotic self for themselves, and what are the ways that I can kind of amplify that? And then the last thing I do, and I'll say this because I think it's important, I'm a fat Black girl. In a world, that's why I got this chair, because I was gonna fall off this chair. Y'all can laugh, it's good. Like, I'm a proud fat Black girl, let me be clear, okay? I'm not on some fat shaming shit, but I am about like creating a world in which I wanna sit in this chair and be comfortable, and so thank you for bringing me this chair, right? But I'm also saying we live in a world that hates fat people and thinks that the reason that we're fat is because we have an unhealthy relationship to pleasure. And so in a lot of the work that I do at the blog, I've been very open about my own sort of pleasure politics and what it means to build it into my life as a way to say, fuck you to everybody who thinks that because I'm a big girl that I don't get to enjoy my life, right? That thinks that I don't get to be a sexual being, that thinks that I don't get to enjoy whatever kind of decadent food I fucking want to eat too, right? Because that's pleasure politics as well. And I feel like Joan gave me the moxie as I was sort of working through what it means to be a big girl, to have that thing too. So I also try in my life, in my work, to represent that I'm an unapologetic fat girl, that I'm an unapologetic fat girl who fucks, that I'm an unapologetic fat girl who likes to eat.
I feel like, I'm trying to think of like a specific piece that I've written about. I mean, I guess the one where we edited that volume of the Black Scholar around the new directions of Black feminism, and I talked about autoethnography. I also talked about, I merged.
Wait, they don't know what that is.
Oh, okay. So, sorry, all of us edited 2 different volumes of the Black Scholar, which is an academic journal, and it was about new directions in Black feminisms, right? And so we all wrote pieces for the 2-volume edition, and one of the pieces that I wrote in it was about the kind of reclaiming of certain figures that I saw growing up, that I kind of looked up to, that were definitely told and written in a kind of cautionary way, in a kind of tragic way, in a kind of bad way. So I merged Black queer theorist with Black feminist theorist to talk about this idea of autoethnography, and in the tradition of Audre Lorde, biomythography, right? So positioning oneself socially and politically, and living one's life in a way that countered all of this kind of anti-Black, anti-woman, those types of things. And so the figures that I look at, that I saw growing up was, I remember watching Color Purple when I was a little kid. And so, I mean, I don't know, y'all are mad young in here, some of y'all, so I don't know if y'all seen it. Maybe seen it in syndication, Color Purple. So the character that okay, good. So the character that I really identified with watching was Suge Avery. But I remember being a little kid and my mom being like, you're not supposed to be trying to be like Suge when you grow up. And I'm like, why not? I felt like Suge was the T. I felt like Suge was free and brave, and she was sexy, and she was, because I think that Joan's book also, too, helped me to not shy away from this idea of feminine artifice, and also this idea of femininity and sexiness, seeing that as somehow anti-feminist. Like, if you're sexy, if you like makeup, if you, wear any kind of artifice like lashes, nails, those types of things, that's like not feminist. And I'm like, who, where, huh? Because again, I feel like my mama, my aunties, they were always slaying and going everywhere slaying and stuff. And, I'm like, those were some of my first feminists. And so how is them being into these things? And I mean, Suge's character is that. I mean, she's supposed to be seen as a unclean woman or a tainted woman. And I didn't see her like that. I saw her as about the life of pleasure, essentially. She was about being satisfied. I mean, all the stuff she says about Mr. was about, I would have had a husband, but he weak though, I just like sleeping with him. I mean, that's what she says, right? I mean, she says, I would have, married him, but he weak though. He ain't gonna stand up to his daddy, and I ain't got time for that. So I just like having sex with him. Do you mind if I have sex with him? You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, she just seems so candid and free. The other figure I talk about is Audre Lorde's Africate, who I was on Facebook as Kaila Africate instead of Kaila Adia for like 10 years, and then I hate her right before my wedding, reported me, and I had to change my name to Kaila Adia. So I don't know who that hater was, but you know how people report you, they're your friend on your friend list. So I'm putting that out there. I don't know what somebody on the friend list reported that wasn't my middle name, and I had to show my government ID and all this. I mean, Facebook's gotten real crazy. So I mean. So like the reason why I liked Africate's, was because of Lorde's perception of Africate. When she meets her, she thought she was all pro-black and all this deep African chick. She's like, her name was Africate, and she's like, what does that mean? And Africate's like, black pussycat. And and so Lorde kept gagging the whole time she meets Africate. She has a certain perception of her being some kind of, urban black queen, and she's this kind of down to earth, regular black woman who was fierce in her own way, in her regularness, in her everydayness. And so, I mean, for me, I saw it as a window. I think that oftentimes the folks we look up to when we're young are folks who we really don't seemingly have access to theoretically, ideologically, and I saw myself as connected to those characters, and I looked up to them, and it wasn't like, I look up to Betty Shabazz and Angela Davis. It's like, no, Suge Avery. You know what I mean? I mean, I got the Angela Davis is cool too, you know what I mean? But the people that I identified with, that I felt like, dang, I want to be like her, So in that aspect, in that specific article, I do talk about the pleasure in viewing, the pleasure of imagining, and then that type of me sitting around creatively imagining my life as a grown woman, thinking about who and what kind of woman I would be, was pleasurable for me. It's still pleasurable for me. In other ways, it's, a lot of the assignments I give to my students, I have them do that very same process. I assign them biomythographies. I also talk a lot about drag culture, house ball culture, which has always been a pleasure zone for me as a young black queer person, going to balls in my youth. Not much no more. I mean, they're too late at night, and I just, last ball I went to, I think I was like 33, and I had to take a nap, and before I went, and but seeing balls as a pleasure space, and all the different elements. So teaching about that, I teach a course called Queer Performance, in which I talk about pageants, drag pageants. I talk about house ball culture. Louisville has a deep house ball culture scene, which I was like, what, Kentucky? But yeah, so like in those types of ways, and letting my young, queer students of color in particular know that these spaces that they've created out of necessity and need are also spaces of pleasure, and spaces of freedom and liberation and those types of things. And so that's how I see it in my own work.
Thank you, Kai. So I'm gonna be really brief. I think that, no, I'm not. That's not true. So I think that one of the things that was very interesting about deciding to do pleasure politics in the environment of the academy is in many ways like, if you're not careful, it's just a failed project from the start. So I'm a writer first, a scholar second. And so language is important to me. Voice is important to me. And I found the academy a place that was deeply invested in the colonization of the tongue. So how do you articulate pleasure in a place that is designed to colonize Black women's tongues? I remember the first day I gave an assignment to my class, and I don't remember what Beyonce video it was, but I just asked them what they thought of the video. So everyone ran back to me all of the isms, like, or this misogyny, sexism, hypervisibility, hypersexuality, and I just went, I let everyone go around. I said, pause. I find it really hard to believe that in a class full of college students between 19 and 21 that not one of you like Beyonce. No, we love Beyonce. Okay, but I'm not hearing any of that in the analysis. And I realized what they were deathly afraid of, and the first thing I had to give permission to was that you cannot theorize pleasure and divorce yourself from the I. And I'm not going to say, as a Black feminist, to Black women that you have to use affect theory to justify feeling. Because my mind as a scholar doesn't work that way. So how do I get to these things? Hip hop, because I come to cultural criticism via hip hop first, the scholar's way of critiquing is to find what is wrong with a thing and make an argument. Cultural criticism from hip hop journalism is, what do I love about this thing that makes me want to write about it? What is the pleasure that I feel in even my displeasure that moves me to passion that I want to write about it? There's no shame in loving the thing. There's no shame in loving the thing enough to critique the thing. Scholarship teaches something very different. I knew I couldn't do this project and be that kind of scholar. And so hip hop, I didn't start writing about hip hop because, I was a hip hop head before I was a feminist, let's be clear. I had to work out what it meant to be a feminist, embrace feminism, and still love hip hop at the same time. So I knew I liked some really fucked up shit. Like, you put the right production on it, and I like it. Like, the beats are there, I just like it. It doesn't mean that I don't know that these things are wrong with it, but I had to be able to hold that pleasure and that critique and tension at the same time. And so I'm comfortable being uncomfortable in doing theory. I don't theorize to get to a comfortable space. I'm most excited about theorizing from spaces that are deeply uncomfortable and complicated, because I think that's where the richness lies. And so, there are times in writing the dissertation where I have to say to my chair, I'm going to use the I. Brittney's book now gave me embodied discourse, so now I have something theoretical to throw behind it. But Black women do theorize from the space of the body and the space of the I. And I think what we do, and that we don't necessarily think of as theory, is deeply theoretical. And so how do you create scholarship that is from that place? So one of the things I started to notice is that as scholars, even in the pedagogy for people who do pop culture, we have trained students to talk about Black women's cultural products in terms of what they represent. It's not even a respectability politics, it's a representation politics. That if you create this thing represents this, and this is what this is saying about Black women or Black people. Where is the language that teaches us to read for Black women's interiority? It's in the interiority that you find our humanity. It's in the interiority that we find the pleasure. It's the interiority that gives us the liberatory lens. And so this dissertation has taken a long time to write, but in part of the reason that it's taking a long time to write is I simply refuse to do it the other way. And I wouldn't have had the strength and the ability to resist the temptation, because, you know, it's easy to throw out some jargon. This is really a game in many ways, and mastering the game is mastering the language, but it is not my language. It is not my tongue. And hip hop gave me the space to create from that. So, you know, yeah, it's a complicated relationship between me and hip hop, but I don't know, we just don't really ever break up. So I don't know how much time we have, but I wanted to open the floor to some questions.
Have to. First, I'm gonna say thank you to all the Pleasure Ninjas for the energy, the warmth, the insight, the brilliance, and for coming into this space that we thought was transformed and transforming it yet again. So thank you. And another comment related to that is thank you for giving us a model of what it's like to come into the space such as this one and transforming the academy from within. We talked about it all day, how difficult it is to operate in these white supremacist patriarchal institutions, and what can we do about it. You're showing us and giving us and embodying a model of what that can look like and what we can do in our own domain. So thank you again for that. Third comment is I want to state publicly that the loving critique that you see in culturally sustaining pedagogies as our theory of pedagogy comes directly from Joan Morgan's When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost. People don't make that connection, but when you read Chicken Heads, especially as a dude, I'm just going to say that, when you read Chicken Heads the first time, it's sort of the first time you encounter somebody who loves you enough to love you like family in a book, and to critique you in a way that means you're still a part of me and the family, and that's a model for intellectual critique and scholarship and criticism. So thank you again for that, right there. Now the question. The question, really quickly, we're talking about pedagogy and hip-hop pedagogy, and often when we talk about education and pedagogy, we're not really thinking about women and young women within the classroom space. For example, we talk about ciphers. We talk about all this kind of behavior that women participate in, but oftentimes when it comes to bringing things to the classroom, a lot of us can see that sometimes there's not really a focus on young women within hip-hop pedagogy. So I'll take all this brilliance and all this theory, and Treva, you talked about doing educational work, and Joan, I know you've worked with some of our students in East Palo Alto. Can you bring this to where the rubber meets the road as far as pedagogy and the schooling of young girls and boys?
So I think about this, I don't know how this ended up, but I ended up writing a lot in education journals, randomly, which was, I don't know how this began. And some of this is just because I started some work around Black girls, and so much of where that dope work was happening was the work of Bettina Love, Ruth Nicole Brown, and so I was, Elaine Richardson, it was so much of beginning to think about what it meant to think of, even when we hear schools and everything, so much of the research was premised around boys and men of, like boys of color, right, in particular, Black boys. And that was so much of the emphasis in terms of understanding the crisis of school. We even got the language of, right, the school to prison pipeline. And I'm like, wow, the school to prison pipeline, that's interesting to think about, because that suggests that a school is safe. And I know, for instance, that schools have often been hostile and terrorizing places for Black and brown bodies. And so I was marking the classroom as a space of anti-Black girl terror. That's also happening. We can look at that, the assault at Spring Valley High with officers in schools throwing girls to the ground, the ways Black girls are read as loud and abrasive and aggressive, which plays out in terms of disciplinary possibilities for Black girls in schools. And we were just starting to get this research with people like Monique Morris to really talk about what was happening with Black girls in the classroom. But the work of someone like a Ruth Nicole Brown, someone like a Bettina Love, in saying, how do we move this pedagogically and think about all those things we say about Black girls as loud, as all this energy, who don't get this, who don't do that. And I'm like, it's really interesting that little Black girls can sit and get their hair braided for 7 hours in these geometric spaces, but you can't get them to sit down for 7 minutes. What are you doing wrong? Okay. Right? There's something very interesting about the ways that we can think about loud and creativity and that can come into the space and be pedagogical tools in terms of engaging Black girls in the classroom. That there are Black girl literacies, there are Black girl creativity that y'all could never touch, right? That is part of how we get to pedagogy as a practice of power, right? And so much of this is rooted in actually sitting and talking to Black girls, understanding the worlds that they're navigating, the creative worlds that they're imagining, and allowing imagination and creativity to take center stage in the space of the classroom, right? That lets loudness be read as, I'm being seen, I'm being heard in a world that's constantly telling me to shut the fuck up. Right, and so Black girls raising their voices isn't always about like that even, but it's also a way of being seen, being felt, being evoked. And we can harness that in a hip hop sense to say, what can we learn from Black girls' intervention within hip hop space and bravado to say these are the things that need to guide our pedagogical impetus, right? The creativity that they bring. And also recognizing that the school to prison pipeline framework is a troubling framework because we know that schools often are some of the most horrific sites for Black girls, right? They are the sites at which their hair can get cut off. They can be teased. They can be told they're not smart enough. They can be told they talk too much. If they're really smart and precocious, they may be attacked for that, even by the instructor. You think you know something, right? And so we have to challenge that framework in terms of our pedagogy to not just be culturally relevant, but actually be Black feminist-centered in the ways that we think about pedagogy and Black girls.
And I would say for people who are, I believe, really well-intentioned, think about how you're constructing your space. Particularly in hip-hop, we sort of say, okay, we want to make sure we drop a few female artists in there. And then we use them as this space to look at problems. We look at them as this space to teach people about sexism, to teach people about misogyny, and we don't look at them first as artists who have something else to teach. So I would really encourage, if that is the way that you're constructing your learning space, to resist that. It's the same thing as having a Black person in a predominantly white class, and then the only thing that you want to talk about is slavery. Yes, you're talking about it, but you're bringing them into the conversation in the least empowered kind of way, when there is so much else that body brings to the space.
So first of all, I wanted to say, Brittney, like, you don't understand, like, as a plus-size queer Black woman, I am proud to be plus-size. I am proud to be queer. And so for you guys to validate that, those parts of me, that intersectionality for me, like, I honestly want to cry and just like on my knees just thank you, because that's just like, that's what I've always needed, you know, as being a plus size person. I know that when I go shopping, I don't matter. I'm not in the stores. It's not meant for me. It's not my space. And so for y'all to like be up there and talking about queer life and gender and sexuality, I was like, okay, I'm not the only one who's thinking this. All right. But then also like you made that very clear is like, yes, I'm a plus size person. So don't think it's weird when I talk about getting a dick down. That's not weird. It's normal. I deserve it. Thank you. But sorry, so like I wanted to just like thank y'all, because like thank you so much, but also my I actually wanted to come back to Treva, sorry. You made a question, you made a little comment, and sorry, I catch on those little things. You said that it's funny that y'all were talking about pleasure and then you talked about violence. That's not funny, that's serious. And I got a question for you. We have opened up this space to talk about, you know, sexuality, it seems like, and the sexualness and the sexual life of Black women. And, you know, we've got like Amber Rose who does things like the slut walk and things like that, and that's great. But does that mean that we're also extending that conversation to sexual assault and sexual violence? And how do you guys feel like in terms of, yes, pleasure, but in terms of sexual violence, how do you think the conversation is progressing? Do you feel like it's getting a little bit easier to talk about? And I want that to be more focused in like the Black community, like a question from that, so.
Okay, I'm trying to think about what, so are you seeing that there's a link now? Like it seems as if people are talking about sexual violence, but they're connecting it to something like an Amber Rose versus actual incidents of sexual violence, like that's being suppressed. And what's, okay, I mean, I agree with that. I don't think that, yeah, I mean.
conversation about pleasure suppressing our ability to talk.
Is the conversation around pleasure suppressing our ability to talk about sexual violence?
So my work really specifically deals with articulating a politics of pleasure in Black feminist theory. And so I will say in Black feminist theory that there is a real commitment to articulating spaces of violence, trauma, and silence. And the models for that are extremely solid. The conversations around pleasure are actually really, really, really small and limited in comparison. Evelyn Hammond's talked about the needs for a politics of articulation, that we don't even have the language to even begin to articulate something past the violence and the silences. And so I think what you're talking about is one of what may be happening in popular culture. And so I don't know that we're doing such a great job of articulating pleasure in popular culture either,
Right.
From a feminist lens, which is what is kind of important to us. You know, we have seen, it's interesting, there are these anonymous Black scholars that just never seem to want to say who the hell they are. And we kind of like, where you at though? Who say to, say like, you know, this has nothing to do, what does pleasure have to do with structural racism? Like, how do you topple structures? Like, this is frivolous work. We saw, there was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education that talks about a panel we were on in Florence and said, it seems like these, you know, some of these scholars, all they do is theorize from their pussies. And Michelle Wallace said, what's wrong with the pussy? It's a legitimate place. So there is a way that that anonymous critique doesn't allow us, scholar to scholar, to have informed conversations. So I think that it's great that we're sitting here and we're doing this, but it's not, we don't want to let you think there is this like explosion of pleasure conversations and that they are now dominating the way that we do Black feminist cultural critique or even Black feminist theory. So, yeah, and I think that we have long, the trajectory that we've had or the experiences that we've had to articulate Black violence against Black women has been much, much, much longer than we've had to articulate Black women's pleasure.
The other thing, just quickly, I would say, like, for me, doing this work, like, I do this work as a survivor, right? Pleasure is important to me as a project, as someone who is a survivor, right? So I think it's important that that connection is not lost. There's such a dearth of things about pleasure, and the fact that to say as a survivor, like, what it means to like sex, what it means to like to fuck, what it means to build connections and intimate relationships with people post-violence. And we're never really post-violence as Black women, right, in certain ways, right? We're never really post that because white supremacy lives, misogyny lives, patriarchy lives. So I do think it's important, right? I mean, we could have a longer conversation about slut walks and pop culture and where pop culture takes this up. But I do think the dearth of actually a robust pleasure politics means we see a certain kind of sluggishness within even popular culture around this and the ways that people engage pleasure in those spaces too, right? I don't think that, not everything we see like, I'm enjoying this is always connected to a pleasure politics. There can be things that are very deeply problematic and traumatic that are within that. So I think that us talking about this and the people that are doing this work are trying to create those spaces where we're talking about a robust and ethical, a just, but a complicated and messy space in which we get to actually think about pleasure.
I have one quick comment about this. I was whispering it to Treva. One of the reasons that we got to tease apart these articulations is because when you think about mainstream hip hop, so much of how men articulate what they think is pleasurable for women is violent, right? I'm gonna blow your walls out. I'm a, you know, I mean, it's all the stuff about.
Out.
It's like I like my walls. And you stay away. Like, so, you know what I mean? But it's the way in which, like, I mean, look, you know, and I always do this with my students, you probably heard it, but it's like all the ways, I just ask them to list all the metaphors for how we talk about sex, right? You want to cut, you want to smash, you want to bang, you want to, you know what I mean? You know, you want to hit it. I mean, literally all of the shit is like, you want to beat it up,
Yep.
All of those are violent fucking words. They're terribly violent words, right? And so even the language that we have to talk about sex in general popular culture is deeply tethered to violence. And so that only changes if you have particularly women in femmes being like, it's not that I don't want you to beat it up sometimes, but I don't, something about but I don't want you to do violent shit to my vagina. Like I want you to not do, like don't do violent shit to me, right? And so I feel like that doesn't happen unless we start to say, this is what feels good, right? Do more of this. It's like, figure out where clitoris is and learn to love it, right? I mean, look, real talk, like, because in my classes where I teach a course on intro to gender, race, and sexuality, and I spend so much time in that class just saying to dudes, like, stop jackhammering. If you fucking ladies, right, stop the jackhammer shit. Like, stop it. Stop watching porn as your manual for how to fuck. It's terrible. Yeah. It's a bad idea. And I think they're looking at me like, why is this fat black lady always in here talking to us about our sex lives?
Hey.
And I'm like, because bad sex will ruin your life, right? And also, and good sex will change your life. So, right? So I think we gotta be, but that's the project that we're engaged in, which is, what is it? It's not just enough to say that violence is not the thing we want. Well, what do you want? Right? What do we want? And how do we create a universe of possibility? So I'm not even saying that you can't be into violence in a BDSM context, but I am saying that then, like, consent, safe words, like the ability to articulate, this is what I want, and I'm entering into these agreements clearly and with a set of expectations about my safety and how this is going to go. And you can't get to any of that unless you actually begin to talk. And so the politics of articulation is not just, it is the thing Joan is saying to us about that critique is not what is wrong here, but what is right. What do we like about it? So thinking about your sexual experiences and being like, well, what did I like and what do I want more of? And then what kind of things can I do to get that? And what kind of, like, in the Crunk Feminist Collective, last thing, I write about how the way that my sex life got better is because I call up my girls and be like, so this happened. Okay, I need to make an adjustment here, there, and there. And then they'll be like, girl, do X, do Y, do Z, go here, buy this product, take a yoga class, do a stretch, get some, whatever, you know what I mean? Like, so it's like I have a whole action plan. I execute this action plan, and then I adjust, right? But it's like but giving people permission to do that like that's my sexual pleasure politic, that if I feel like I have the right to it and I want to know how to do it, and if I don't know how to do it, then I know to go ask some people who are having better sex than I'm having, and then they tell me what they do, and I'll be like, let me see how that work out, right? And so that is what it means to articulate a pleasure politic, is that we're literally trying to create some shit. I think we know a lot about what's wrong, and I think that we're trying to figure out how to say to people what's right. Yeah.
We have time for at least one more question.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much, ladies. Like, I don't really know who you are, but just hearing your introductions now made me a fan of your work. And so now I want to go back and read everything you just put out. But the question I have to ask you is more of a serious one, because growing up, seeing black on black love was a common thing. Nowadays, it's not. And there's something I remember studying in Black history was about kind of like, as you were pointing out, the demonization of black women and their sexuality. But one thing I do remember growing up is that there's a lot of like black fantasy books. So my question for you is, what role does a fetishization of the thug versus the nerdy black guy play into the stigma that black women do not want to be loved? Because I always hear growing up that you talk proper, you're a nerd, you're white, so I don't want to mess with you because you're not black enough. So what stigma does that, what does that play in the stigmatization of that black women do not want to be loved?
Now, brother, okay. Look, I mean, other folks can weigh in, but I think, it's hard. What I want to say is that, I think that we just have to be a little bit more generous with each other. So I always liked nerdy black boys, but so let's hold two things in tension, because you're talking to a person who got called white her whole life because I was nerdy and liked to read books too. And I grew up in a particular space where there weren't a lot of black kids who could sort of access that experience. But the thing I want to say to you is that this actually isn't about, like, so one, I think that what happens when we're younger sometimes is, I think the way that men have told me they experience, nerdy men have told me they experience this as, girls like bad boys, they overlooked me, and now that I'm 30, now all of them are calling me and I don't trust none of them, because now that these bad boys have ruined their life, now they want a nerdy dude, right? That's the way that the story, and here's what I'm gonna say to you about that. I'm going to say to you that nerdiness or bad boyness doesn't have anything to do with whether you've done the emotional work to love a black woman well. And I know lots of nerdy dudes who are trash as fuck to black women.
Yep.
And they often use their intellect as a cloak for not loving black women well. And they use that resentment about the fact that they didn't have swag in high school and girls weren't checking for them as reasons to sort of resent. And so it becomes this narrative about how black women, you know, it's like it's a bunch of good dudes, but y'all overlooking good dudes. It's like statistically, actually, the prison industrial complex stole a bunch of our dudes and put them in prison. And so structurally there are real issues. And so I want to say that to you as a way to say, not that I don't hear you, but the commitment to the kind of love you want is to make sure that you're actually the good partner that you think you are. Because a lot of dudes think they're good dudes and they're trash. They think they're good dudes because they're smart and they got a car and they got a job.
Yep.
Right? And that's not what makes you a good dude if you don't know how to show up.
Stud same way.
So that's the shit, right? That's the shit.
So, you know, I wanna say something about allow 52-year-old me to make a generational kind of comment. And I'm not trying to be ageist about it. I think that you came up at a time that is very different than the time that I came up with. So my hip hop is different than your hip hop. My language of courtship is very different than your language of courtship. And I wrote Chicken Heads from a space that black men were not disposable to me. No matter how deeply problematic it got, that I'm not gonna be free if you guys are not free. That said, I think that the culture of social media and this deeply visual, disposable culture that you live in has a lot to do with not like thug versus nice guy or educated or this person thinks you're white, but really you guys live in a culture where you swipe to the next thing, where a better thing is always around, it's just one swipe away. And so, in places that you should be having conversations, you text. In places where you should be doing deep emotional work with each other, you break up with each other over a text message, or a Facebook post. You are deeply expositional in what should be your private relationships. You don't value enough face-to-face time and conversation and real connection with people. And if you don't have those as the basis, there is no black-on-black love. There isn't. I don't care if it's nerd, thug, you know. If you are basing your value on how many Twitter followers you have, or how many Instagram likes you get on like a selfie, or you think that like, she's cute, but I just saw her friend's gram and like, I could possibly get it over here, or vice versa, whatever the permutation is. When you sort of treat people in the way that we've been taught to, in this very disposable, very visually led, very temporary, fleeting digital context, it's impossible that our relationships are not going to reflect that.
Hi. I want to say one last thing about, because I do think there's a cultural piece. Treva and I also talked about this a lot, which is about that, like, I think we have to reckon with what happens because hip hop has for more than 30 years normalized the calling of women bitches and hoes. And I don't want to blame hip hop for sexism and patriarchy and misogyny that are deeply American, but I do want to say if we have any ethical commitments to each other, then we are going to have to reckon with the cost of what it meant to normalize those things. So that, for instance, one thing that's different even from Joan's age group to my age group to your age group is I feel like we were the last generation of people who grew up with real love songs. And you guys don't have love songs, because when I ask my students what are their love songs, they be like, we listen to what our parents listened to in the 90s, right? And so I guess the thing that the one thing that I would say to you guys as artists and creatives is, will you model for a new generation what it means to actually be vulnerable in your art, right? Because I grew up in a world where dudes actually said to women, like, I love you, I want to be with you, you're the best thing that ever happened. Or dudes said, like, she cheated on me and I'm devastated, I wish I never met her at all. And I wish I never met her at all is very different, and it's not the same, it's the same experience, but compare that to these hoes ain't loyal. I wish I never met her at all versus these hoes ain't loyal. It's about the same thing, right? Somebody cheated, and one dude is like, that shit really devastated me, and another dude is like, fuck all y'all. Right? And so that inability for masculine folks to be vulnerable specifically, right? And to say, you're gorgeous and I desire you, and sure, I want to fuck, but my desire for you is not just about fucking, but it's because you're pretty and you're cool and like we could have some conversations, right? You used to get that kind of sentiment in the music, and now you don't get it anymore. And to the extent that art and music and creativity, like, it's our first script about how to be intimate, right? Like, when I liked boys when I was a kid, then I would sit around and listen to all my music to help me with my feelings, right? So that I would know what kind of things, like, people felt when they were in love, right? The music did that. And so if the music doesn't give us scripts, it's the first most accessible place we have, particularly for some of us who come up in families where we don't have it from our parents, right? So we have a universe of possibility in the music, and I don't want to ever be that sort of old ogre that's like, y'all shit ain't good, but it's like, because I like to see hip hop, Black feminism, Black people, always as possibility and never as failure, right? Then I think the thing to say is that it is possible for you guys to create a new emotional universe where you, in your music, where you put on the table again real desire, real vulnerability, and like that you're gonna have some stakes in the game. Everybody wants a lot of intimacy, but nobody wants any risk, right?
We have time for one quick rapid fire question before we must get out of here. I almost don't want this to end.
Okay, thank you. All right, so first, just thank you for sharing your truths, collective and individual. Thank you for sharing your theories. And I know we don't have much time, but just to put pleasure, politics, subjectivity, and real talk into practice, what was your most pleasurable moment this week?
This week. Something to share in public? Let me see. I'm trying to think. I mean, for us together, it was for us all together, because there are various moments for me that are pleasurable. I mean, I try to stay in constant pleasure spaces and energy and mindset that gives me perpetual joy, right? But when we all got together, like I was sitting in the hotel, and I had been there for hours, but I didn't think the rest of the ninjas was there yet. And I get like weird and shy in moments, so like I didn't text nobody either, which was, so I was just sitting there like watching TV. And so she was like, when do you arrive, hun? And I'm like, I'm already here, I'm in the hotel. And so then, they were all in Joan's room, they had been there for a while, right? And so we got together, we were talking, we were laughing. We were like doing funny stuff. I mean, falling out laughing, not like, like for real, like belly laughing, then torturing Joan with the songs that Treva and Brittney were torturing Joan with. And Joan's like sobs. I mean, so like that was a definite moment, and that moment, because we all live in different cities and in different spaces, and we're away from one another for a long period of time, and you really don't recognize how much missing has been happening in the apartness. And so that was a very deeply pleasurable. I mean, I feel like we've been having them like all day, all evening for the past couple days, And then before that, it was like, talking with my mom and laughing with her before I got on my flight. My mom can't back up in the driveway, and I mean, in our house, and it's like she just can't do it, and so I had to do it, and then she like speeds at odd and weird times. I mean, so anytime I'm laughing and I don't, I'm not taking myself or people that I love too seriously is a pleasurable moment. So I mean, those are definite moments for me this week.
It was a good week, actually, for pleasure, for a lot of reasons. I'll say this has been a joy. This has been a joy. I'll say I got to meet one of my closest, oldest friends, baby, and I hadn't met them. I was in New York and got to meet him, and he is just a really happy baby. Like, he got so much charisma. He's like 11 weeks. I don't know how you have charisma at 11 weeks, but whatever it is, he got it. He was just charming everybody in the restaurant, but it was also such a thing because he was named after her father who had passed away suddenly. And so it was very beautiful to connect that, and it brought us back because I'd known her since I was 11 years old. And now, parents and looking at this little one that's hers and taking charge, and we had good food with it too. A lot of our good times have a lot of good food in it. And
definitely that.
And then my other pleasure moments were grown folks.
Okay, yeah, very grown moments.
Very grown moments.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, I baked a really good apple pie cheesecake bar.
Yes.
For Bae. I got that fat girl food thing for real. So I baked those for Bae. He loved them, and he rewarded me like good grown people should.
Yes.
And I'm with my girls, and I have laughed so hard. Last night I was like, I'm gonna faint because I can't breathe. And so, yeah.
My pleasure moments for me, I can always tell when I'm in a really good space because I barely check my phone. So I will pick up my phone and there are like 20 text messages. And that rarely happens because I have my phone next to me often enough that 20 messages don't accumulate. I didn't know really what was going on social media this week because I was with people that I deeply love. So I'm a priest of Yemoja, so I have a very deep, and I've been a priest for 20 years, and I have a very deep and strong spiritual community that was originally based out of New York and Brooklyn, and now they're moving all over the place. So I went to visit some of them. They sold their apartment in the area that everybody's trying to move in Brooklyn and bought 8 acres outside of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. They fucking have chickens. They have farmland and a river behind the house. They also have a sauna and outdoor shower and hot tub, so they haven't completely become Farmer Jane and Joe on me. But they also have a 2-year-old, and so at one point it was and my child is 18 and a freshman in college, so generally having a 2-year-old in the house is something that's really, really far away. But one night I was just exhausted and I realized it was 9:30 and they really live deep in the cut, as in if you turn off a light, I couldn't find the bathroom in the middle of the night because there's no light. But at 9:30 I just felt happy and satiated enough around people that I love that there was nothing left to do but go to sleep. I didn't want to turn on the computer. I didn't want to stay up and watch Netflix. My brain usually races until 2 o'clock in the morning. I wasn't thinking about a dissertation. I wasn't thinking about this other book that's due in February. I wasn't thinking about any of those things. I was thinking about the fact that I felt full. And I went to sleep. I thought I was just going to go lay down, but at 9:30, I was out and I didn't wake up again until 5 in the morning. I am evil at 5 o'clock in the morning. No one should talk to me at 5 in the morning ever. Certainly not pre-coffee. And then there was just this 2-year-old waking up at the top of the stairs, Auntie Joan, are you awake? And that was just a beautiful moment of pleasure for me. And I left them and I went to see Dr. Mark Anthony Neal, who was my first best friend. We've been friends since we were 3. We went to school preschool together, and I went to go talk to his graduate class at Duke. And then I came here, and I'm able to have fellowship with people that I brought together through work who have become my sisters. And so to me, those times that I get to spend in real connection with people, and not the performance of people, which is what I kind of, our curated selves that we put up on social media, self-included, are really my most pleasurable times.
Let's give it up for the Pleasure Ninjas. Let's give it up. Thank you.